So today we're going to talk a little bit about the Reformation. During the Middle Ages, Christianity had been the main focus of everything in Europe, but there started to be a lot of criticism of the Catholic Church. So the Roman Catholic Church had gained a lot of power in Europe, especially during the Middle Ages. The church had owned a lot of the farmland, but they had started to wander a little bit too far from their spiritual roots, and a reform movement called the Protestant Reformation wanted to bring the Catholic Church back to the roots that it started with. The people were pretty much the most upset about the heavy taxes and the indulgences. The church essentially said, hey, in order to get into heaven, you have to buy an indulgence. And so they started trying to make sure that the taxes were going straight to the church. The church was spending a lot of this tax money on Renaissance artists. So the leader of the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther, came out with a lot of the criticisms of the sale of indulgences. All of his criticisms he summed up in his letter, the 95 Theses, that he put on the door of the Catholic Church. Martin Luther's biggest criticism was the fact that he believed that God's grace could not be won through good works. He thought that through faith alone, grace could be won. He also said that the Pope is not the leader of the Christian church, but it's actually Jesus Christ. He is the first person to translate the Bible into vernacular, or the language that's spoken by the people. It's kind of like saying ain't instead of are not. This was a big deal because this was the first time in which the Bible could be read by people without somebody from the church reading it for them, because the only people educated in how to read were the clergy. In 1520, Pope Leo X excommunicated him from the church, which means that he essentially said, Martin Luther, get out. Martin Luther was summoned to appear before the newly crowned Holy Roman Emperor in the German Diet, or Assembly, at the city of Worms. This is when the Edict of Worms came out that said that Luther was an outlaw, and that anybody who followed him were horrible. Just like anything that is against the law, it becomes super popular amongst the people, and Lutheranism, which eventually becomes Protestantism, aka Protestant, became very popular in Europe. Other leaders came out as well. John Calvin, John Knox, and the Anabaptists are some of the other people who came out against the Catholic Church and started forming different sects of Protestantism. John Calvin was influenced by the ideas of the Renaissance. He talked about the idea of predestination, that God knows who's going to be saved before people are even born, and that there's nothing that you can pretty much do to try to get a different end. He led the Calvinists, who viewed people as sinful by nature, and so they followed strict laws that were trying to regulate people's behavior. John Knox became the spokesman for Protestantism in Scotland, and he formed what's the foundation of the Presbyterians. The Anabaptists insisted that baptism should not happen until adulthood, and this is where the foundation for the Baptists come about. Henry VIII became King of England in 1509, and he had become very critical of Martin Luther's reforms until his wife had only birthed him one child and left him without an heir to his throne. So he wanted a divorce, aka an annulment, so that he could marry again to get a new heir. The Pope said, you can do this, you can do that, you can do this, but you cannot get a divorce. So Henry VIII summoned Parliament and said, hey, will you approve for us to break away from the Catholic Church so that we are no longer under the authority of the Pope? And they approved it, and so Henry VIII became the head of the Church of England, or otherwise known as the Anglican Church. He closed all of the Catholic monasteries and started redistributing the land to the nobles, just so that he could have an heir. Some Catholics had been working even before Martin Luther to try to reform the church. This became known as the CounterReformation, counter to Protestantism, or the Catholic Reformation. The Catholics had met at the Council of Trent, trying to examine a lot of the criticism and come up with solutions that they could do to make sure that the Catholic Church didn't lose its power. It focused mainly on corruption and also required certain training and the end of indulgences. To counter the Reformation, the church established a church court called the Roman Inquisition. They were trying to get rid of anyone who had been a part of the Protestants or practicing witchcraft or breaking church law. If you were found guilty by the Roman Inquisition, you would be kicked out or excommunicated. They also issued a list of books that they warned would cause people to lose their souls and end up with them not going to heaven. The Inquisition damaged the reputation of the church instead of improving it. So now that they had two groups of conflicting parties in Europe, the Protestants and the Catholics, there were some religious wars and some unrest. Peasants overall had started to have more of a desire for freedom from corrupt governments that had taken advantage of them during the Middle Ages. Charles V began a war against the Lutheran princes of Germany and Protestantism. In Germany, the Peace of Augsburg was signed that allowed each prince to choose the religion for his state. The only choices, though, were Protestantism and Catholicism. In addition, another group in France, the Huguenots, fought for years against the Catholics, and there was overall unrest about what type of religion there should be in Europe.